P. So the third dimension, or looking at 120 from that perspective, is dealing with understanding 120. Now, like I said earlier, the one dimensional perspective are people who just look at 120 historically. They look at it in a very linear fashion and they say, well, that was the past. Those calculations was made in the past. They're obsolete. It's not important for the present, and I'm definitely not going to see them as important for the future. And they say that the lessons are dead because anything linear eventually flatlines. The two-dimensional perspective is also somewhat superficial because two dimensions also lack depth. And these are people who look at the length for the purpose of elevating their own personal growth and development. So they may tend to look at things as they're above, they're elite, and they're better than everybody else. Other people are beneath them. And they tend to deal with lessons like they're jousting, like American gladiators or something. They come and say, well, it's like a one-upsmanship type thing. This is what I found out about the lessons. Top that. You know what I'm saying? So it's very superficial. It reminds me of the school of sophists in Greek society who just used to practice the art of debate, not because they're striving to arrive at the truth and see what's right, but just to see who can artfully put an argument together the best. Now, you have people who do it that way as well, and they also lack depth. Now, the third perspective is truly understanding lessons, which is beyond just looking at it historically and beyond just looking at it as your own personal elevation or growth and development. You're actually gaining insight, because that's what depth is. It's insight. You're gaining insight and you're looking at how these lessons can penetrate your life, as well as those who are engaged in those lessons that you're sharing this information with. So these are people, when they look at like a lesson like the second lesson or the wisdom degree in the 1 to 14s, why did Musa have a hard time civilizing the devil near 2000 BC? These are people who look at that lesson not just historically and say, well, that's Musa or Moses back in 2000 BC, and this is how he handled the situation. Or they're not just looking at it like, I'm going to flip and bounce and recite this lesson and go back and forth with people so we can see who's better. These are people who look at the lesson and say, what principles did I learn from looking at this lesson? What principles are there? What principles are obvious? And what principles are implied in this lesson? What does it teach me about sacrifice? What does this lesson teach me about patience? What does this lesson teach me about frustration? What does this lesson teach me about relationships? They begin to examine the lesson from that perspective. And then they also look at it as far as what values do they get? What is important in that lesson? If you look at the bottom of the lesson, it says civilized means to teach knowledge and wisdom of all the human families of the planet Earth. So people who are gaining an understanding, they'll look at that part and say, well, knowledge and wisdom, that's 12. 12th letter in the alphabet is L, that's love. So in order to teach civilization, there has to be a degree of love and concern and consideration and respect for people. Because if you don't have love for those who you're striving to teach civilization to, you won't have anything that is civil. It's impossible to do that. So people who are approaching it to gain an understanding, they're looking at how these principles of life can be applied to help them not only elevate their own condition personally, but how they can share that with others so that they can help elevate their condition as well. They're looking at the values, what is actually important in these lessons, and then they're also considering procedures. And when I say procedures, I'm talking about the way in which things are done. Some people today are having a very hard time civilizing or teaching civilization because they haven't examined Musa's degree or that wisdom degree well enough. Musa had a hard time. They're having a harder time. You have other people who have a easier time because when they looked at that lesson and they saw the procedure Musa was using, it was like, nah, maybe I need to use this procedure instead. So these are people who are looking at principles, values, and procedures. It's kind of like one thing I teach people is that when you look at the 1 to 14s or that body of lessons, you have various different procedures of how to deal with adversity or how to deal with the adversary or how to deal with devil, whether that devil is something that you're striving to exile personally, as far as dealing with some type of addiction or dealing with anger management issues or dealing with whatever internally. there's various different procedures of how to handle that situation. You know, you look at the first lesson, it talks about preserving the best part for yourself. So that may be the appropriate way to handle that situation. More focus on the positive. Don't put too much energy into the negative. That's not as significant. That is the way you need to handle it. But now when you get to another lesson, it talks about not caring. That's the understanding degree. So you don't care about the poor part. That's just being indifferent. That's like saying whatever. You know, that may be the appropriate procedure as far as the way to handle a certain adversity in your life. But then you get into other degrees where they talk about exiling and taking everything away from them but your language and making them walk every step of the way. And then you got other lessons that talk about people just striving to clean themselves up and come amongst you, or you taking that approach as far as things in your own life that you need to clean up and the way that you need to handle that situation. But then you have other lessons that just talk about cutting that off, period. Because if allowed to live, it'll just sting somebody else. You know, so you have various different procedures that is not relegated to something that's historical or an event that happened in the past. These are principles, they're values, and they're procedures that you could apply to your life. So when we build one another, that's essentially what we're exchanging with each other. We're not just talking about being archaeologists or paleontologists, or we're just looking at it from a historical perspective and saying that's something that happened in the past that's not important to today. We're looking at these as references or resources of how we can handle life situations now and the potentiality of this way situations may turn out in the future. So I will, this was inspiring, it was empowering, it was educating for those of you who really want to understand why we say that knowledge in 120, wisdom in 120, and understanding 120 makes us 360 degrees complete in regards to the way that we live this culture. 120 lessons is 75% of our cultural curriculum. Those people who diminish, minimize, or just relegate 120 lessons is something that's not very important, that don't understand the actual principles, they tend to look at things in a very one-dimensional or two-dimensional perspective. And that's one reason why it's difficult for them to see the life or the three-dimensional perspective of 120 as I'm sharing with those of you. So peace and have a beautiful day.